Miguel, can what we eat improve ADHD?
Definitely. So that's the short answer. And now, because I'm ADHD, I'm going to give you the very long answer. So basically, yes, everybody's a little bit unique. So ADHD can be experienced by different people in different ways. But definitely, you want to be supporting your executive function in the brain. Largely, that's based in the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. And in ADHD, there's a lot of emotional dysregulation. So people feel that their emotions are actually driving them more than their logic. So doing things in a sequential order, or changing from task to task, or even just the anticipation of a task can actually make you quite nervy.
Yeah.
And then you procrastinate and you don't do it and all this kind of stuff. So if you take anything that is going to give you a quick burst of energy, like a very starchy meal, or a very sugary meal, or loads of coffee, that might give you a really quick release of energy, but it's going to burn out really quickly as well. So I think the basis on which people should be thinking about eating to, I wouldn't say like improve their ADHD, but to improve their ADHD symptoms, or to improve how they experience their ADHD.
Gotcha.
A good balance of protein, complex carbohydrates, which carbs get a bit demonized as well.
They do.
Oh, carbs are bad. Well, you need them. So good protein, whether it's plant-based or animal. Plant-based, for me, preferably, not because I'm a vegan, but because plant-based protein will also give you fiber, which is really important to then soften that spike of sugar that's going to keep you energized throughout the day. So in a way, it's almost like an ADHD adapted blood sugar control diet in a way. So your good protein, your fiber, minimize anything ultra processed. Read the ingredients on labels. I just use real food as much as possible. So those are broad strokes as to how you manage your ADHD naturally.
You mentioned ultra processed. Are there particular elements of hyper processed foods that litter most supermarkets that can exacerbate ADHD symptoms beyond the sugar and refined starches that can put you on a sugar roller coaster?
Definitely. I'd say anything that's got names that you cannot pronounce and loads of E numbers. Some E numbers might be inoffensive, maybe just a little bit of coloring that may be based on curcumin, for example. But some of them have been seen to have an effect on people who are neurodivergent, so ADHD, autistic, because they may actually block the way that you absorb other nutrients. So they may do things to the microbiome, and there's now good science on how emulsifiers and things like that might actually have an impact on the diversity of your gut flora. And then because of the gut-brain axis, that I think we're going to be talking about anyway, the connection between the gut and the brain, your gut microbes are not doing the best job that they can do for you. And that's going to have an impact on how your brain feels. So anything that when you look at labels, if it doesn't look like food, if it's a coconut, it's a coconut. If it's an apple, it's an apple. There's no mistaking. If it's something that you need to look at the label because it comes in a box, there are many variations of ultra processed. So I, for example, did a clinical trial on comparing people who ate vegan sausages and meatballs and burgers. So fake meats, basically. I don't like the terms, but that's how it was publicized when it came out, and it attracted quite a lot of attention. It's been cited a lot of times now. Every day I get a citation. It was a small clinical trial, 20 people in a group, replacing their animal meat, so animal proteins, so fish, meat, eggs, and so on, with the plant-based protein. And then the other 20 just continued as they were, just eating the regular kind of like British diet. And it was really interesting to see the changes in the gut microbiome, which was what we were trying to measure, basically. The composition had actually changed favorably in people who ate the plant-based protein. And we saw something very interesting as well, that a group of microbes that produce this thing called butyrate is a waxy molecule, a little bit like wax that you put on your hair or something like that. It's that kind of like consistency, a little bit like butter. It's called butyric acid. In fact, butter has got a lot of butyric acid and that is produced by a group of microbes. We'll probably talk about them later, but Faecalibacterium, Roseburia, Coprococcus, and so on. And we saw an increase in the abundance of those bugs, and also we did some analysis on how they produce, on their function, and this thing called metabolic pathways of those microbes. And we saw a trend. It wasn't significant in terms of like, a proper statistician telling you this is a significant result, but there was a nice positive trend. So what this is telling you, and the hypothesis as well in the study, the way I wanted to formulate it, is that not all ultra processed foods are actually the same. Okay. So if you look at how the company that put the products together, how they put them together, and you look at the list of ingredients, there was minimal things that you could think, oh, that's actually nasty, it's going to do me some damage. It was pea protein. Okay, so from a pea to the pea protein, you need to process the pea, and it ended up looking different to the pea, so you couldn't actually figure out from the protein that you see in a powder that is actually made of peas. But then the effect on the body was positive. So that bit of ultra processing was actually beneficial to the body, if that makes sense. And they combined it with rice protein, with rice powder, with psyllium husks, with sesame seeds, whatever. There was a lot of wholesome ingredients in there, but processed in a way that if you actually went to the manufacturing plant, you wouldn't recognize them from the food. So we can be a little bit too purist as well. And we live lives that are complicated, and people go, it took me an hour and a half to come here. If I got hungry on the way and I got something from a shop on the high street, I don't want to be freaking out because there's been something ultra processed in my day. There's always going to be something in your day that is not what you had planned.
Absolutely.
And I think that kind of focusing on controlling everything can actually be quite damaging for your mental health.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there is this puritanical streak in the conversations that we see online about removing all processing from your diet entirely, and that, as you just pointed out, is just not possible when you're living in an urbanized environment. Yes, it might be if you live on a farm, but not when you're living in a city environment, or even a suburban environment. And it's interesting because my initial thoughts were potentially if you're having the meat product, that might be beneficial in some certain circumstances to some of the ultra processed vegan products or plant-based products that we see on the shelves. But I guess the type of processed, and I'm saying that in quotation marks, processed product that was used in your study seemed to have like really good ingredients in pea protein, psyllium husk. These are all things that we know are uniquely beneficial for the microbes in our guts. Do you think there is, I know that was a small trial, are there other studies that have looked at the quite refined and very different sort of unwholesome vegan plant-based products out there?
This is growing, but obviously there's the politics of the industry. So it's not in the industry's best interest to actually put themselves out to scrutiny. So this was a little bit of a fluke study in the sense that, they were looking specifically at the microbiome, and it just happened to turn out that way. Anytime that you have a product and you do a randomized control trial, and you're actually going through the whole of the ethics process that it involves to go through a university and everything else, you just don't know what the science is going to say. And it's a bit bad to actually then not publish it because the results are negative. So I think there's big money to be made in plant-based products. So what I was saying before, most days I wake up and I get a citation. The study was published 2 years ago. It's got something like 70 citations already. And which is, I've done other studies before, they get like 3 citations, 4 citations, like 3 years later. This has raised a lot of interest. I think people are kind of like interested in the idea, but then they haven't got the guts, for lack of a better word, to to go ahead and explore that just in case it's negative.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I was chatting to Robert Lustig on the pod a few months ago, and he did this big project in the Middle East where they looked at processed foods and try to optimize them from an omega-3 point of view, increasing fiber, using more wholesome ingredients like psyllium husk, for example, that I've spoken about on the pod before. And there seems to be a middle ground whereby you can have sort of the taste, the texture, but also the price point that is acceptable to many people, which are the benefits, quote unquote, of the processed foods that we see today, with some of the added advantages of wholesome ingredients. Do you think that, I mean, we're going a little bit left field here, but do you think that is a potential middle ground, or the way forward for both the food industry and us as a population to improve health?
Yeah, I think people like convenience. So when I was looking at the literature before engaging in the study and formulating the trial, formulating the hypothesis basically was a little bit different to what people may have been expecting, because what I was saying is that not all ultra processed foods are actually detrimental to the body. And then of course we had an endpoint of the gut microbiome, and we were looking at changes in composition and metabolic pathways in microbes, how they actually function. But when I was looking at studies, it was interesting for me to read that vegans, and again, my study was actually based on flexitarians, so actually people adopting a largely plant-based lifestyle, but not necessarily going vegan, which, it's not for everybody. It's not, the commitment is big, and there's a lot of politics involved. Not everybody wants that kind of thing. Lovely if you want it, not everybody does. The flexitarian literature was telling me that people actually like products that look like the real product they are trying to replace. So they had done studies in several places. I cannot name one right now, the top of my head, but they had done studies comparing groups of people given something that looked like plant-based protein, but it didn't have a shape. And another group of people given the same, but it actually did look like chicken. It looked like a chicken fillet, or it looked like a sirloin steak. So it actually did look like the product it was trying to replace.
Yeah.
And the preference was much stronger for the product that it was trying to replace.
Right. Yeah.
The texture, the smell, the look.
Yeah.
So if you make a beef steak, the more it actually looks like beef, people were more attracted to it.
Yeah.
So
I've seen some of those as well. They look really realistic.
Yeah.
They look incredible now. Like the speed at which this industry has traveled over the last 2 years is phenomenal.
Yeah, exactly. So that tells you exactly what people want. So to go from that to something that may be a little bit more wholesome, but may not look exactly what you're trying to replace, it goes back towards the just use whole foods all the time, which is more of a commitment. I think people want the convenience when it comes to these foods, because everybody really can cook from scratch to a certain extent. Even tinned foods or jarred foods are excellent sources of nutrients. Just because they are cheaper, they are not necessarily worse for your body. So everybody can get some black beans out of a tin and some corn and something else and mix it up with a bit of olive oil and make a wholesome salad. Do you want that? And do you want to invest the time in doing that for you? Or do you want something that comes ready packed and it gives you the illusion that you're having something else? So there's a lot of psychology involved in this, and also like going deep a little bit into the psyche. Are you worth it? Do you think you deserve that? So you're investing the time on creating something that is really wholesome. Or are you not that bothered and you think, oh, no, I'd just rather have the 5-minute burger that comes in a pack?
Yeah. That's a huge point. And I think that doesn't get enough attention because it's very easy and you could look at it through the lens of price. And I would argue you can find healthy, wholesome products at a similar price point. Time, you can, like you just articulated, bung a few things in a bowl, mix it together with some olive oil, and then that's your lunch, and that's cheaper and easier than a sandwich. but it's the psyche, it's the psychology. Am I worth this? Am I comfortable in my own skin? Do I feel like I deserve it? All those different elements that are a little bit harder to ascertain and a little bit harder to sort of bring out in a patient or in someone that I'm consulting, for example. But I feel that that's an underlying tone that I'm getting as to why people struggle to eat well every day. We're gonna go into that a little bit later.
Yeah,
I feel.
Yeah.
I want to bring it back to foods to improve ADHD. I know that you were involved in a probiotic study, I believe, where you gave people kefir, I think it was. Is there a role for probiotic foods and ADHD? Is there any improvement there, or is it again just sort of improving the gut microbiota and improving sugar balance? What are your thoughts on that?
So the study is ongoing. We published a pilot study a couple of years ago. We then just about to publish the study protocol, this is the politics of science and publishing. We nearly done with the randomized control trials. We've seen a number of people and put them through the trial. We're going to begin writing that and extracting the data. Is looking good, but the protocol hasn't been published yet because it's going to be published in a high-profile journal.
Okay.
And it's literally taken like a year and a half for it to be reviewed. It's kind of So these are the kind of things that happen in between, behind the scenes in science that people are not really exposed to.
Yeah.
So it's cute that the actual protocol will probably be published like later than the actual RCT.
Right, yeah.
So cut a long story short, the pilot looked at children who were not on medication or on CBT. So they have been diagnosed with ADHD, and we did require the diagnosis, even though we'll talk about being diagnosed and just identifying or later. But in this case, we were looking at formally diagnosed by a clinician, children from, I believe, 8. I may be wrong, but I believe 8 to 15. And we looked at the symptomatology, so severity of symptoms. And again, in ADHD, there are different symptoms that you can take into account. So you can look at hyperactivity within in children. It can be quite noticeable. So like tapping, and doing things like this, or like tapping with your fingers, all of this kind of like nervous kind of stuff is a way to regulate your emotions when there's too much going on in your brain. So it's quite physical, can get irritability. For parents, it can be difficult because they can be a handful and they're just struggling. They can also be inattentive. So you can just, I can probably put this here, then forget where it is, and I get into a panic just looking in the room, and I go back to the tube station thinking I left it at the tube station. I'm convinced, and it was there all along. That's happened to me like all my life. My mom used to laugh at me when I was living in the house, because I used to leave my keys all the time. And I literally, every single time, I went 3 flights of stairs down to the ground floor and thought, oh my God, my keys. And I went back up and she was already at the door of my flat, with my keys. There you go. Like things like that, and books and all that kind of stuff. So that we looked at all of those, and it's a multidisciplinary team. So it's led by Dr. Kate Lawrence at St. Mary's University. She's the principal investigator. There are people from Goldsmith. There are nutrition people from St. Mary's. So psychology, neuroscience, microbiology. We have Professor Paul Cotta as well, has joined in the later studies. So what we're looking at is changes in the gut microbiota. The pilot allowed us to see that we needed to look at function as well. So you can analyze changes in your gut in different ways. You can also look at what the bacteria are actually doing, which goes a little bit deeper into the detail. So we basically looking at what the pilot churned out. I suggested that we needed to look at what the microbes were doing as well. So it's another way of looking at microbes called shotgun sequencing. It's a little bit more precise, so it's different than 16S, which looks at composition. And we look at a number of psychological measures as well. Self-reported, very important, and I'm a big proponent of self-reported because it goes into something we're going to be tapping into, lived experience. everybody's experience is different, and unless you ask them, you miss out on that. And it's great to have a number. The number is precise, and statisticians love a number because it's like, it's easy to process. If you ask me how I'm feeling and I just go on and on and on, and you need to transcribe that, you need to then process the interview, you need to code it, you need to understand what are you looking for in what I've just told you in an hour. You just let me talk. So the bit in between are these things called patient-reported outcomes. You basically have like a structure and you follow some structure, so it ends up being like a number, but you've taken the person into account. And then loads of other things that the psychologists know better than me, because they are kind of sleep measures and a thing called actinography as well, which tells you about different functions of the brain and so on.
Right.
So basically we put all of that together and the results look good. So drinking kefir is more complex than taking a probiotic, because kefir gives you is a whole food, and it gives you, apart from the probiotic bacteria, it gives you probiotic yeast as well. So this is a booming field in the microbiome field, because we talk about lactobacillus and bifidobacteria all the time. These are the kind of like stars of the show.
Yeah.
But yeast are hugely important. We tend to think of yeast as bad, but we used to think of bacteria as bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Years ago, and now it's all the rage. So yeast have a very, if I had to summarize in a quick word how they function, they have a very interesting way of functioning. Well, two ways. One is they crowd out other microbes, because they take out a lot of space in the gut. And the gut is a limited room. And if you invite 20 people into a room, you're going to be more crowded. And you're hoping that the nasty people will leave the room.
All right.
You invite nice people in, the boring people or the nasty people will go. We'll talk about that later. And then the second way is that they stimulate the immune system. So they kind of gently touch the lining of the gut. And the gut contains a lot of the immune system in the body. A lot of what happens with how your body reacts to infections stems from the gut. So if you gently stimulate how your gut cells are producing mucus, for example, that mucus feeds beneficial bacteria that they can chomp at it and feed on the actual mucus. The mucus is very rich in a mix of protein and carbohydrate, and it contains a lot of nutrients. So then the beneficial microbes that you want to stay in your gut are thriving, basically, especially the ones that like to live next to the mucus. And there's a whole section of them. And they happen to be bugs that produce this thing called butyrate. Again, we go back to the same things. And butyrate kind of like lubricates the communication between the gut and the brain. So you have this weird thing going on between the gut and the brain, and people say the gut is the second brain and all this kind of, but nobody really understands. Even like, I did my doctoral degree in that, gut microbiome and mental health. If I had to tell you in like 2 words how it works, it's like very difficult because there's so many things going on. But it's almost like you have an internet connection, sending messages, like a broadband connection between the gut and the brain. And you have loads of different actors, and gut bacteria are almost like the protagonist in this thing. But the actual system itself is really important. So how healthy is the actual gut lining? How healthy is your digestion from your mouth to the other end? If you're not chewing properly, you're not going to get the opportunity to extract nutrients that then may be needed further down in the small intestine or in the colon. If you're really stressed, and that's the top to bottom branch in that communication. If you're really stressed, what your body is going to go into is this kind of like fight or flight response. And we told, fight or flight, there's going to be a lion coming to get you and all this kind of stuff. But there's no lion. It's just your bills, your Instagram notifications, your whatever, anything that is just requiring your attention all the time.
Right.
It's sending you into this mild state of panic. Your brain is thinking it's panic, but then you're saying, no, it's fine, it's not. So you're constantly using energy. And this for ADHD people is actually very exhausting. because you have a more difficult time actually switching from one thing to the next, because you might be hyper focusing on something and it takes you away from that, and then you get resentful, and there's a lot going on in that brain that people who are not ADHD don't need to contend with. But there is that broadband communication system, and there's a wire. It's called the vagus nerve, and again, you'll have heard about it. I'm sure you've had loads of people talking about the vagus nerve here. And then there's the Wi-Fi, which is hormones, tiny bits of protein that are these things called peptides that are the basis for things like serotonin and dopamine and neurotransmitters that are, again, communicators in the brain. They do things differently outside of the brain. So there's this thing that people say serotonin is mostly produced in the gut. And to an extent it's true, but it doesn't mean that the serotonin in the gut then goes into the brain and then it makes you be happy all the time. It's a lot more complicated than that. And there's this butyrate, and butyrate, again, I refer to it as a lubricant, because if you have all of those cables, wiring, and all of that communication going on, it's almost like getting an upgrade onto your Wi-Fi. So you go from like very poor Wi-Fi to cable Wi-Fi, like 1 gig each way. And that's what butyrate is doing, is promoting that really smooth communication between the gut and the brain both ways.
I really like that term you used. Butyrate is lubricating the connection. And this Wi-Fi analogy is pretty apt for me, because I've struggled to get Wi-Fi in this building. So I'm loving these analogies.
So you need to call your Wi-Fi butyrate.
Yeah. I need some sort of lubrication to the Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
I just wanted to double click on the serotonin point you made there, because I think you're right. I hear this a lot about serotonin, mainly produced in the gut. And whilst, yes, it does have an impact on mood, you're probably going to tell me it's complicated and we don't have a clear answer, but why is serotonin produced in such quantities in the gut if it doesn't have the impact on mood directly?
So serotonin is produced by cells in the gut called enterochromaffin cells, long mouthful name, but the most important thing is that it's produced to allow you to go to the toilet, because it helps with gut motility.
Right.
So if you haven't got enough serotonin, you probably struggle having a regular poo. And that is one of the main things that it does. It's also a regulator of vasodilation. So basically how your arteries are expanding and contracting to the rhythm of the heart. And then that translates into the expansion and contraction of tiny capillaries that are kind of bringing oxygen to tissues that in all parts of the body. So it has a role in that as well. So it's completely different roles to what it does in the brain. So this is called peripheral serotonin. It's mostly produced in the gut and then used peripherally, so not in the brain.
Okay.
And then you have the serotonin in the brain that does regulate mood. It regulates, to a certain extent, appetite as well. It can make you feel connected if you produce it at the same time as other hormones as well. So it's not just high serotonin means more bonding, more connection, but if you produce it in an environment that leads to connection and you're hugging somebody, you might feel that you love them. So it's kind of like the hormone of or the neurotransmitter of love and bonding and connection. And for example, mothers and children, when they are looking at each other's eyes, or when you're looking at a dog in their eyes, they do that as well. We produce this thing called oxytocin, which is another peptide that makes you feel connected to that person. You're probably producing oxytocin because when I'm looking into your eyes, I'm doing the same. It helps understand the situation. It also has a double edge. The oxytocin is, if you look at evolutionary medicine, is there to assess whether the person you're talking to or you're looking into their eyes is an enemy. So you need to be, kind of like judging, do you trust them or not? So I think it's just been blown into is the hormone of love. And, you want to hug everybody and kiss them. It's kind of like, it's got a
double-edged sword.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then if you produce that with serotonin, then it's a lovely kind of like bonding experience, and it's what you feel if you had to kind of like talk about the chemistry of love and attraction and so on, this oxytocin, the serotonin, and dopamine as well, because dopamine is about anticipation about what's going to happen. And again, another little bit of a myth about dopamine is that, get your dopamine by completing tasks. Dopamine doesn't give a damn about completing. It's all about what's going to happen.
Right.
And that's why it's really involved in the reward system. And when you look at the negative elements of dopamine, it's involved in gambling and sexual addiction and drug addiction, any substance kind of abuse. I worked in mental health nutrition for a while, like 6 years, in a multidisciplinary team led by a consultant psychiatrist, working with people who lived with addiction issues. And you see the pattern psychologically in this kind of like profile of person is all about what's going to happen. And then once you've done it, it's whatever. If you are really, it's the expectation of doing the drug, and then you do the drug or the drinking, and it doesn't satisfy you. As to why, we can talk about that later, and it resonates a lot with food as well, and with trauma, and with loads of things that might be going on in somebody's brain. But yes, I find it cute that there's a lot of Instagram activity about like, completing your task will give you a hit of dopamine. Dopamine is not produced by completing a task; it's produced by the anticipation of the task, and it's about preparing you for the task. Maybe a little bit produced when you complete the task, but that in itself is not going to give you the
gotcha. This is great, because I hear these sort of like little nuggets across social media, and to have it from you to explain it in that way is just a lot clearer in my mind as well. And we've basically been speaking about the gut-brain axis. If you were to articulate what the gut-brain axis is in a couple of sentences to a newbie without the sort of lengthy explanation and how complicated it is, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so it's the gut-brain communication system. So it's the gut talking to the brain and the brain talking to the gut. The brain talking to the gut is going to be more binary. It's going to be more kind of, yes, no messages. Go to the toilet, do not go to the toilet. Mostly it's about that, really. If you look at narrowing down what it's doing, processed food, do not process food, because you're stressed. If you're stressed, you don't want to be using energy in your gut to be processing food, because the stress response wants you to get away from that lion, imaginary lion that's going to come and get you. If the lion is going to come and get you, your brain is going to reduce the appetite response, doesn't want you to have a sandwich and have a chat with the lion, wants you to leg it from the lion. So it's and it's also going to stop the juices being produced that are going to allow you to process that food. So people with IBS, for example, with problems that haven't got a label, so many people, bloating, gas, irregular times they go to the toilet and all this kind of stuff, allergies, all of this, they are not processing food properly because their brain is hyperactive. It's saying to the stomach, do not produce stomach acid, slow down, do not churn the food into a little baby food, kind of a consistency so it can be processed. Okay, so I go back to the definition. So there is that going down from the brain to the gut. From the gut to the brain, you're basically getting again that lubrication in the system. You're getting kind of signals from the environment. So butterflies in the stomach typically is this kind of intuition, something's going to happen. There's a lot of neurotransmitters involved in that kind of thing as well. And you're getting a better absorption of nutrients that are going to play a really big role in the brain. The brain is a heavy machinery with lots of cogs. It gets easily inflamed. It can get inflamed because of the activity. It's a lot of what we call free radicals, basically from friction, from just the way that it works. It's a heavy supercomputer. So it's almost like getting heated, and then it needs to cool down at night and kind of process what's happened during the day. By having a healthy gut, you have a better chance to process what's happening in the day, to cool down the system, so in the morning it's actually working better again. And in a way, that would be a simplistic way to talk about that. It can go into many different avenues. Even you look at a healthy person versus a person with a susceptibility to anxiety or depression or a neurodevelopmental condition like ADHD or autism. There are many different avenues that the health of the gut microbiome can actually have an impact on the brain. But in general, is to calm down what might be happening in the brain. That is mostly your immune system in the brain reacting to things, and your central nervous system reacting to things. So we, as a species, humans, are very good at picking up signals from the environment, and the brain just goes on one and starts kind of, and everybody I'm sure can relate how you need very little input for your brain to start thinking about things. That uses a lot of energy. When you're using energy, it's almost like if you imagine the brain as a supercomputer and it's processing a lot of information, it's heating up, it's almost like smoke coming out. There are immune cells in the brain that get heated, they turn into super active, I want to kill everything that may be a threat, and that produces some toxins in the body in the brain that they need to be cleared out. It happens normally in the night when you're asleep, but then again, we don't sleep as much as we need to, or we break our sleep because of exposure to screens late at night, or caffeine, or alcohol, or a diet that is not conducive to good sleep, stress, and so on. So there's a lot of stuff that kind of like converges.
Yeah. And it goes to show just how complicated this topic is, because you can go down threads, and that thread has an impact on lots of other threads, and other threads have an impact on that as well. So
it's all connected.
Diet and sleep and etc. A lot of people talk about neurotransmitters being produced. One of them being serotonin. You have those short chain fatty acids, your acetate, propionate, butyrate we were just talking about. What is just to zoom in a second, and we'll zoom back out, because I want to keep the sort of listener on a journey of where we're going and the viewer. What is the mechanism by which these neurotransmitters actually have an effect on the brain? Do they actually cross the blood-brain barrier in certain circumstances? Because I think there was a suggestion that serotonin was doing that. Now you've articulated already that that's not necessarily the case. Are there other metabolites of digestion in the large intestine that can cross the blood-brain barrier in certain circumstances?
So a lot of the neurotransmitters that are produced peripherally stay peripherally. But you do have the precursors, so you have the building blocks.
Okay.
So what happens is that you have a meal that is rich in tryptophan, for example. Off the top of my head, like foods rich in tryptophan, beans. You're looking at like plant-based beans, always have everything because they're amazing. But otherwise, poultry is typically the thing that if you look at dietetic books, it's like is top of the list in tryptophan. So you'll produce some serotonin using that tryptophan. You'll change that tryptophan into more digestible versions of that tryptophan, of that amino acid, that can actually cross the blood-brain barrier. Depending on how if you're looking just at serotonin and without getting into a chemistry class, depending on how diverse your gut biome is, and depending on how many of the beneficial microbes you have versus potentially other microbes that are detrimental to the gut because they produce substances that damage the gut lining. So depending on this balance, if the balance is on the good bugs, then you have a better chance to produce positive versions of these tryptophan serotonin compounds that can go into the brain, and they can be converted into serotonin, and they have anti-inflammatory activity, and they feed into the right channel, so you get the most out of that serotonin.
Gotcha. Yeah.
If you don't have an amazing balance in the gut. Like most people will fluctuate from day to day, but if your balance consistently is towards the bad bugs, or the bugs that are in the gut, but you don't want too many of on a regular basis, then you're more likely to produce negative versions of that serotonin compound that will also end up in the brain and will be neurotoxic.
Okay.
So serotonin as a tablet, if you could have it, have this serotonin tablet, if you took it in your gut, it's very difficult for it to actually make it to the brain in that current form. But versions of it can actually go through the blood-brain barrier.
Gut testing more broadly.
Yeah.
So you mentioned shotgun sequencing, the 16 S RNA that gives a different sort of fidelity to the investigations that we have. How useful do you think it is for people to understand or to actually do gut testing on a regular basis if they are asymptomatic, i.e. they don't have any gut issues and they just want to know, versus if they do actually have, let's say, IBS symptoms or a diagnosis of IBS, for example? Do you think it's useful for people to have this sort of knowledge, or do you think there are things that we can do without the unnecessary detail?
So it is useful, and I've worked in microbiome testing for a long time. So obviously I love the information you get from it, but equally it can get obsessive, and that's the risk. So what people need to take into account is that the microbiome is like, imagine trying to take a snapshot of London today. So you take a photo of London where you see, how many people with like different faces, physiognomies, races, whatever are in London at that particular time. And then you start making plans as to, I'm going to build this housing here and I'm going to make 3 new parks and blah, blah, because there are so many people who are young and they need schools. So, okay, let's knock up another, 10 schools and 3 more hospitals. You take a photo of London 3 months later and it's completely different. So the risk is that if you're going to make changes that are wholesome, all-encompassing, take into account your psychology, take into account why do you want to make those changes? What are you chasing with those changes? Then I'd say if you're happy that the right reason is coming from within, go ahead and do all the explorations. If you're going to go into the small detail and you get freaked out because your Faecalibacterium was 11% of your microbiome last time you tested and now it's 7%, and you go into a complete frenzy of like, I wanted to increase, or my Akkermansia is so low and surely that's bad for me because I'm trying to lose weight and Akkermansia is the skinny microbe and whatever, then that is completely don't do it, because that's going to send you down a downward spiral. So, and I want people to actually learn about things. And again, if you look at it from the point of view of testing, if you go to your doctor regularly to get your cholesterol checked or your iron or whatever, it makes sense to keep an eye on that. If you've had a hint that your cholesterol may be on the border of not being good or whatever, you wouldn't just do that and then just not have another cholesterol test for 10 years. So it makes sense to kind of like keep an eye on it within reason. That in Spain, people freak out about cholesterol quite a lot. So it's very rare that anybody's got less than maybe like 3 blood tests in a year.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. The Spanish NHS is like full of people like, freaking out about their cholesterol. My dad has been,
wow.
It's like, like Brits talk about the weather, like Spanish people talk about cholesterol. It's like, how is your cholesterol? Oh, my triglycerides are really good. There's a lot of prevention in Spain as well, so that's good. The system is slightly different, so that is a good element. But people are very they've got a hypochondriac kind of like streak to their personality. I think it's the culture is like, and
has that translated into better cardiovascular outcomes, do we know?
Yeah, definitely. There's
really?
And there's loads of studies done on cardiovascular prevention and cardiovascular health, and the PREDIMED study was done in Spain as well, and and there was a whole branch of that. The PREDIMED study was a study done, it was one of the iconic studies initially done on the microbiome and different health outcomes, basically, and cardiovascular health is one of them, because it was done by people in the University of Navarra, which is one of the best places in the world to have cardiac care. So there's a university hospital in there, and so definitely I think it's the context as well, like Mediterranean eating and all of that kind of stuff. But so going back to testing, why would you want to test? So you learn a lot about composition if you do a 16S test. So it's not better or worse than shotgun, it's just different. So a blue jacket is blue, a green jacket is green. It's not better, or it's just different. So 16S is telling you about how the microbiome, it's almost like building a catalog. So, and it goes through a lot of processes, but then the person gets percentages. So it's abundance of microbes like lactobacillus, rosaburia, ruminococcus, whatever. Now, to interpret this, sometimes you need to bring it down to a simplistic level. And you were talking about good bugs and bad bugs. And some bugs get a bad report for, I don't know, for some years. And then suddenly there's one study that looks at how a type of ruminococcus may not be bad, may actually be the next probiotic. And then people start thinking, okay, so all ruminococcus are good. And then there's an understanding of biology that maybe the person on the street doesn't care about, which is you go into levels of how those bacteria are classified. And ruminococcus is this thing called genus. It's a big group. And then you have some nasty ruminococcus that can cause some damage, and they have been seen to be detrimental to the body. And they are the species. And you have some species that may be detrimental, some species that may be beneficial, and maybe groundbreakingly beneficial. So Ruminococcus bromi, for example, is supposed to be an amazing thing, and there are loads of studies being done on it. Ruminococcus gnavus with a G is supposed to be detrimental, and there's loads of studies reporting how you could have infections from it, and whatever. So you have the two. Now 16S is really good at looking at things very accurately to that level that doesn't go into the species. When you go into the species, it kind of like loses fidelity. So it gives you an understanding roughly of how your gut is doing, because your gut changes a lot. And you even have, below the species, you have strains which are even more specific, which you could have the Rupi strain, I have the Miguel strain of the same microbe, because it's learned to behave differently in our bodies. So, and now what we are learning is that strains have their own characteristics, and they can actually give you either a benefit or a detriment. So it all gets a little bit tricky when you're looking at it from a high level. It does give you an understanding, are your lactobacillus low? Are your bifidobacterium low? Because mostly they are beneficial, and you can hardly go wrong by supplementing lactobacillus by drinking kefir, for example, or eating more yogurt, or feeding your bifido with fiber-rich foods. Like bifido has an affinity with this thing called inulin, which is in chicory, it's in Jerusalem artichokes. It can feed from other fatty acids that are made in the gut by other microbes as well. So it's difficult to get it wrong when you target specific microbes. Butyrate producers that I love, I think they are the next frontier on how we need to be tackling the microbiome. Faecalibacterium, there's a microbe called Faecalibacterium prosnitzi that's quite famous. It makes a lot of butyrate, and there's a lot of it. So when you measure somebody's gut, it's difficult not to see probably like 10% of a person's microbiome is going to be Faecalibacterium. Rosaburia might be like 4, 5, 7%. So they are substantial compared to tiny lactobacillus might be a 0.05. So in comparison, they are really active, but they are tiny. You could, if you're really, really active in your lactobacillus, you could have a 0.5 or something, but it's not a substantial amount of the microbiome. When you're looking at shotgun, you're looking at specific things. So again, 16S is like you're casting a net, you're picking everything up, and then you're classifying it. This is lactobacillus, this is blah, blah, blah. This is, you create this kind of like like a library system.
Yeah.
And in fact, when you're talking to the bioinformaticians, the people behind the scenes doing the clever things, there are different libraries that you can actually tally up what you're picking up from your poo against. So you're comparing that what is in there is actually that. Now with the shotgun, it's literally just like fishing for one particular fish. So it's almost like a shopping assistant that only goes to Gucci.
Okay.
So you say, darling, only one Gucci. You got Bond Street, but don't get me anything from any other brand. Only one Gucci.
Okay.
And you're basically using that assistant to Gucci, and it only comes back with Gucci goods.
Right.
So you know exactly what you're getting. You're getting your Gucci bag and your scarf and whatever.
Yeah.
And then you send them out again, and they go Louis Vuitton or they, they
go
Primark. But you're getting, you know exactly what you're getting.
Yeah.
And with the 16S, you haven't got that fidelity. But then shotgun doesn't tell you about everything, because you haven't got to Bond Street and just got information from all the shops. You just gone specifically to one of the shops.
Right.
So you just basically, you need to program the software in a way that, yes, it will be very precise that what you have got is particularly lactobacillus, longum, substrain, blah, blah, blah. And you know exactly that is that. But you're missing out on the whole community.
Right.
So in an ideal world, you'd have like a bit of both. As
Yeah.
opposed to just basically assume that X, Y, and Z bugs are good bugs, X, Y, and Z bugs are bad bugs, and then give them that reputation, because science is fluid.
Yeah.
And you need to sit on the fence a little bit, because if you go too far onto saying something is whatever, you're going to have a harder time later saying, actually, I was wrong, and this is now good. And there's a lot of that going on in the microbiome.
Yeah. It's so complicated, and I love the analogy. It's cleared it up for me in my head as well. And if we were to sort of step back, and the listener and the viewer is like, okay, great, I get it. Gut testing is complicated unless I'm really doing it with a clear reason. I'm taking a targeted approach. What are the general things that I can do beyond sleeping well, eating enough fiber, lots of diversity in my diet? You mentioned kefir that you're particularly excited about because of the yeast content. What are the yeasts that you're specifically? What are the yeasts that you're excited about? And are there other probiotics in food that would be better than a targeted probiotic, excluding the sort of specific circumstances where you might use a probiotic supplement?
Yeah, so I'm excited about kefir because not only because of the yeast, that there are a few, and it depends on whether it's real kefir or whether it's kefir cultures. So you can make kefir with this thing called kefir grains. They look like weird, like little creatures, like little sponges or something. And they're a combination of yeast and bacteria, or like a SCOBY. Like people are more familiar with the SCOBY for a kombucha. It's technically the same thing, but with a different community of microbes. And what they are doing, they are metabolizing, they're digesting the lactose in the milk, and even some of the proteins, and they're just making this thing called kefir. So if you make it that way, then you have the full whack of microbes. Or if you buy it from somebody that has that kind of thing, if you don't want to make it at home. If you just buying the kefir from the shop, what you're getting is a yogurt with added kefir cultures, which is typically Lactobacillus kefiri, another couple of similar bugs. And so you're just getting, if you in your regular yogurt, you might get 2 or 3 different microbes. In your kefir, you might get 10, 15, according to what powder has been added to the process.
Right.
It doesn't make it necessarily bad. I'd still have the one from the shop, because if you compare it with yogurt, you're getting more for your buck. So for me, kefir is a winner always.
Okay.
The only thing is that I also like yogurt, and I don't like to say just because it's good for me. I like the creaminess of Greek
it's
yogurt.
Different.
It's completely different experience to the kefir. To make a kefir like that, it's difficult, and then you need like added stuff to the yogurt industrially, and then you get into the processing. You want a kefir that's thick set, like Greek yogurt is likely to have something added to it, typically starch or something, and I don't want to be messing around with that. So just keep an open mind. But kefir is nice because it's got like things called postbiotics as well, which are quite trendy, which literally are dead cells, fragments of the membranes of the cells. They still have the ability to stimulate your immune system. It's also the fatty acids that are being produced within the product while it's still live. So there's still butyrate being produced and acetate and so on. And that's also called a postbiotic. So it's got a nice mix. It's a whole living ecosystem, and I like that a lot. People who are sensitive to lactose, they can have this thing called water kefir, which in some studies it has been seen to contain up to 52 different microbes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it also depends on how you do it. You put in sugar into the fermentation, so some people freak out. Most of the sugar is eaten by the microbes, but it's a bit like kombucha. You need to put the sugar in for it to get the kick. So it's the same kind of like principle. So I would say, yes, my favorite, but if you look at studies that have been done recently, like people from University College Cork, John Cry and Ted Dynan, they did a really interesting study that was published last year, looking at the microbiome of people who participated, and also self-reported measures. So again, PROMS, this patient-reported measure, is looking at partly of the lived experience of the person, but in a more controlled way. So looking at stress, there's this thing called perceived stress that is a well-validated questionnaire. It's 11 questions, very simple to answer, and from different angles, you're basically answering to the researcher how stress is affecting you, and literally by combining a number of different fermented foods as opposed to just focusing on one, and looking at there were students stressed by exams. So this is a typical environment because it's quite ethical, because you're not putting somebody through a stress per se. You're looking at somebody who's going to have the stress anyway.
Yeah, it's a natural experiment.
Exactly, it's a natural experiment. It's very nicely done. I love these guys. They're so elegant. They just produce so many studies. Like literally, you can have a new study every day. And literally, the results were that those in the group that had the typical Irish diet, which is very similar to the British diet, following the eat well guidelines, kind of, so to speak, healthy enough, but without fermented foods.
Right.
The addition of fermented foods added a layer of wholesomeness to their gut-brain connection,
right?
And it reduced the perceived stress, basically. So there was a reduction in perceived stress so perceived stress is about how you react to a potentially stressful situation.
Right.
It's almost like if you want to make it into something that is not, but you could make it into improved resilience.
Yeah.
You become more whatever to stress.
Yeah.
So
that's brilliant.
Yeah.
And how would you remember the dose of the?
Yeah. So literally, it's 3. I think they're recommending at least 3 portions, and it doesn't need to be a huge amount. But in a nutshell, is a variety of different fermented foods. So they recommended kefir, but they also kimchi or sauerkraut.
Okay.
Sourdough. And again, sourdough is a funny one because you don't get the live microbes.
Yeah.
The microbes, by the time you bake them, you fry them, basically.
Yeah.
But you get the dead microbes, so you get postbiotics.
Gotcha.
So the actual starter is rich in lactobacillus and so on, and some yeast, and then you kill them. So it's got that kind of a probing the immunity of the gut gently by the dead microbes. So literally what they are saying is combining a fiber-rich diet with extra probiotic foods is actually beneficial for that gut-brain communication. And there was another study published in, I believe the journal was Cell, and it was a couple of years ago, and they compared a fiber-rich diet with a fiber-rich diet plus probiotic foods.
Oh yeah, that was Sonnenberg's lab, I think, Stanford.
That's it.
That's
a
great
the one.
study.
And literally it's the same. So fiber was kind of like version 1.
Yeah.
Everybody's aware now that fiber is there for a reason, and if you have more fiber, you might get a little bit gassy. That's telling you that your microbes are doing their job. Everybody has wind, it's natural. And then if you add a layer of what people call probiotic foods, fermented foods, you can get very purist as well. Because some people say they are fermented, are not probiotic. Okay, probiotic means pro-life. Fermented have been fermented by microbes that are typically beneficial. I'm not gonna get too funny about it. I think it's just easier. It sounds nice. Probiotic foods. So fermented foods, if you have a range of them, I think that's my philosophy anyway in life. Just a little bit of everything that you think is good for you, and that makes you feel good, is likely to be better than just focusing on something like really massively and going, I'm just only gonna have mushroom powders. You were telling me about mushroom coffee. I'm only gonna have that. And
definitely not mushroom coffee. I think the mushroom coffees out there taste horrible. I haven't tried a decent one yet. But I'm trying to like add a little bit of mushrooms into my drinks just to see what the effect is. I'm just experimenting. Non-psychedelic mushrooms are for now.
That's for another day.
Especially at the start of the day before this podcast. On that note about how people can get quite sort of fixated on, whether something is fermented or probiotic or postbiotic. The other thing I think many listeners will have experienced when they go to a health food store is when they peruse the probiotic aisle, or even, the fermented food aisle, it will say it's got X number of strains, it's got, 5 billion CFUs, colony forming units, or ours has got 15 colony forming units. So this is, people make the assumption in the head that this is better or stronger than the other. How, if you had to educate someone navigating the sort of complicated health food aisle in a supermarket or a health food store, what kind of things would you advise them beyond, just go for the fermented foods, get diversity in, ensure you've got high fiber? Are there any sort of extra trinkets of information that you would give them when trying to decide between which probiotic?
Yeah. So in general, if you haven't got a concern, you just want to make your life easier and benefit from better digestion and so on, the evidence points towards multi-strain. So anything that has got more microbes is going to be is a wide spectrum. So in a way, there may be fewer studies on some of the ingredients than on some of the others, but by combining everything, you're kind of like hedging your bets in a way. You're thinking, okay, well, because it's all depending on the person's lifestyle and genetics and everything else, then you're kind of like thinking, I've got a little bit of most things that are likely to be good for me. And I think that's the best bet.
Okay, best hedge.
Exactly. If you're looking at, particular situations of like mental health, anxiety, the studies are still very embryonic. So there are some probiotics that, like Bifidobacterium longum, for example. There's a couple of strains that have been used in anxiety, depression, with good effects. But my only issue with that is that most studies are done for a month. They are really expensive to do studies, especially when you're taking loads of measures as well. So it's not just like I feel better. It's not just a questionnaire. When you're taking bloods and poo samples and everything, it goes into hundreds of thousands of pounds to do a study that is anything to write home about. So I would just say have expectations that are realistic, because I'll mention another study that was just published earlier this year. Researchers at the University of Santiago de Chile, it's on a Chilean study. They looked at people taking probiotics, and they looked at their lifestyle, and they looked at different health measures. And they basically concluded that the reason why the group that took the probiotics versus the group that didn't take the probiotics felt better was not because the probiotics themselves, but because of the lifestyle factors that they engaged in.
Okay.
So, they created subgroups basically when they analyzed the whole study.
Yeah.
But they looked at people who were less stressed, for example, or who had, they call them more positive lifestyle behaviors.
Okay.
So basically they went out in nature more, or they talked to friends more often, and they met socially. So all of those things, we are complex beings.
Yeah.
So if you just try to reduce it to, I'm just going to continue with my life as it is, maybe in an unhealthy relationship, maybe with myself, with my partner, with work, which is massive, toxic environments at work are massive.
Yeah.
I'm going to take this, bifidobacterium, blah, blah, and it's going to sort me out.
Yeah, yeah.
It's going to add a little angle if you put all of those other things in place. But if you just continue doing what you're doing and not allowing time for yourself to cook healthy meals, to do your exercise, again, exercise, a massive positive association between exercise and movement in general, with positive changes to your microbiome, more diversity. It's almost like when you're out and about doing stuff, you're breathing your microbiome and you're implementing that into your own. Also, if you just at home, like doing a few weights, or you have a bike at home, it doesn't need to be a super expensive, super complicated thing. Whatever you're doing when you're moving, you're engaging your muscles, you're engaging your mitochondria in your muscles as well. There's a relationship between that and the health of your gut flora. You're making your gut work because it's a muscle, and the muscle, again, another very interesting thing, people talk about leaky gut. Leaky gut happens all the time when you eat. The gut goes a little bit leaky. It's part of how you get your nutrients into your bloodstream. And people get really freaked out by that. But there's a lot of interesting correlations between positive behaviors and things that you can do that everybody knows are good for them. A healthy relationship with your employer, a healthy relationship with your partner, being generally happier in life, not because of the things around you, but because you are happy inside. If you look at all of those things, then they have an impact on how any drug is going to work. And because we're looking at probiotics in a very pharmacological way, we basically, the studies just look at them as if it was a drug intervention. Inflammation goes down, all of these kind of like markers that you look at, the kind of as if you were giving somebody a drug that's been made in a lab, but you're putting something live that lives in a community of microbes. You isolated it and you're taking that, so it's likely to do something good, but it's not going to sort out your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So the marginal effect is there, but you can extract much more of an effect if you do all the other lifestyle things in addition to the probiotic that you choose.
Yeah, definitely. So. And if you wanted to really go into a health optimization kind of thing, that I like the term, but it also freaks me out a little bit. There's a lot of obsession in that.
Yeah,
I would go for choose your strains.
Okay.
For particular situations and really well-studied strains, and then add a prebiotic that's going to fit those strains and is going to fit the rest of your microbes. So I really like a prebiotic that's called galacto-oligosaccharides or GOS.
Gosh, yeah.
It's very similar to something that you get from your mom if you've been breastfed. So it's very similar to human oligosaccharides that are really well studied because they give you kind of like the start of life. They feed your bifidobacteria. A really nice affinity with bifidobacteria, potentially with some lactobacillus as well, but definitely with bifidobacterium, potentially with other bugs as well. Bifidobacterium then is a really clever microbe and has good relationships with other microbes in the community. So by feeding your bifido and keeping it happy, you're doing a service to the whole of the community. So if you wanted to go that step further, I would say focus on feeding your microbes a good prebiotic by means of your diet. by making your diet more prebiotic naturally with fiber, with like your healthy salads, your diversity bowls that you do are amazing. That is like your bifidobacteria kind of like going, yes. And then if you want to add something that is broad spectrum, is well studied, and is a nice prebiotic for your bifido. Inulin can be good as well. I'm less inclined to use inulin on a regular basis. There's been some preclinical studies actually, again, just looking at how people they respond differently to different interventions. So if you tend to have a susceptibility to inflammatory bowel conditions, and it may be hidden, and you're feeding yourself inulin, it may make that worse. So there's been, again, it's just preclinical, there's been a couple of very small human studies as well looking at how type 2 inflammation, which is inflammation in the lungs, so people with asthma, for example, will have that, or COPD. If you feed yourself inulin, you may be increasing the susceptibility for that type 2 inflammation. It's genetic. So just because of that, I wouldn't not have inulin. So if it's in something that you're having and it's like one of the ingredients, fine. I wouldn't have 20 grams of inulin every day.
Devil's in the dose.
Exactly. Okay. So, you know, if you have a multi-watted, you know, powder with a bit of inulin, fine. There's a difference between doing that and going hammer and tongue for inulin, and like, you know, 20 grams, 50 grams, people do crazy things. With gauze, apart from getting a lot of wind, if you have 50 grams of gauze, you'll probably go to the toilet and you'll have a lot of wind. It's very, very safe. And it's a good regulator as well for people with IBS. So IBS that fluctuates from diarrhea to constipation, gauze is a nice kind of a regulator to bring you back to balance.
Brilliant. Look, there's loads of info in there in terms of what you've just said about the general sort of probiotics. Look for a multi-strain, go for something that has some prebiotic effects as well. Ensure you're having diversity, lots of fiber. I want to get into the human side, because what you just mentioned there about us consuming a live product that goes into a live community in our digestive system that is part of us and our community around in the interactions that we have in the real world, whether it be stress, work, etc. You know, we sometimes can get quite focused and laser on just the chemical processes of everything and everything being binary. And I remember the first time I met you a few years ago, and you're rattling off your sort of background, the number of degrees you've got. And I was like, wow, how on earth does this guy do all this work? And you recently got a diagnosis of ADHD. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the ADHD 3 years ago, and recently autism spectrum disorder, or autistic.
Gotcha. I want to talk a bit about your experience and how you've got to that. But perhaps I've made a mistake of assuming that the audience know exactly what we mean by neurodevelopmental disorders, neurodivergence, and all these terms that we throw around, ADHD, autism. Maybe we should take a step back and just go through what those are, perhaps the traditional diagnosis method, and why a lot more people are finding out that they actually have this afflicting them and has afflicted them throughout their whole life, but they're finding out a lot later in their life.
Yeah, certainly. So there's a book that's a manual. It's called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders, so the DSM. There are different versions of it. I think we're on 2.6 soon, but it's literally like a guide that will give you every potential explanation for somebody who is diagnosing somebody else with a mental health condition, and they need to tick all the boxes. So you have pages and pages, you know, for everything, for depression, for postnatal depression, for anxiety, for different types of anxiety, for, you know, ADHD, autism, everything is in there. Now, the book is called Disorders, Manual of Disorders, right? So what is emerging lately as a kind of like movement is the fact that
yes, there may be disorders in some cases because they affect that person's ability to deal with life. And that is going to basically, their life will not be ordered. So from that point of view, yes. But there are loads of people who just happen to approach life in a different way because their brain is slightly different. It works in a slightly different way. That to me means that we have, just as we have different types of people with different ears and different skin and different, races or whatever, we also have like different neurotypes. And that is a kind of like movement that is growing. You're looking at ADHD and autism particularly. So you have, when you talk about autism, and there's a lot of stigma about autism because people immediately think, non-verbal, extremely, unable to communicate, somebody who just looks down, and like an extremely difficult child that is just basically going to have a very difficult life. And because it's a spectrum, it can be like that. And there's no doubt that that person is going to need a lot of support, and it needs to be there for them. At the other end of the spectrum, you have what used to be called high functioning, which I hate because then it kind of like creates this like, oh, you must be high functioning, and itself is kind of a very ableist way of talking. So you have somebody who may actually experience the world in a completely different way, and they may be suffering as a result, but they have masked around that suffering, and they are not showing to everybody else that they are suffering because you adapt, and you may feel that you don't fit in from early age, but you create coping mechanisms around that. So, typically with ADHD is you create, ADHD, again, you generalize, but, joking and, being the funny guy or whatever, that can be a coping mechanism because if you don't fit in and you're bullied, if you make the bully laugh, then probably they're not going to bully you anymore because you're going to be the funny guy. So instead of the weird guy. And that was definitely my experience. I was bullied, all through school and, never fitted in and everything else. And I think that to me was like a coping mechanism. If I'm funny, then I'm kind of like, I can get away from the situation where I maybe, my sports bag is going to end up in the toilet again. So there is that. There is the fact that a lot of people are actually missed out by the system because you create those ways to behave around the system, so you're not singled out because you don't want to be like constantly tapping like that and being told off by the teacher. So you internalize that hyperactivity, which is textbook what happens in adulthood. So a lot of people have gone through their childhood being a little bit like, the naughty child, the, loud child, whatever. I ticked all the boxes when I had my assessment. The forgetful child, problematic, all the rest of it. Then you get to about 15, like the sex hormones kind of like kick in, you turn into a little adult. And you start seeing the world, I don't want to be singled out all the time. I want to fit in. I want to be part of a community. I want to have mates. I don't want to be the weird one that only has, barely no mates with like absolutely no friends. So you start creating an environment that suits you so you can thrive. So you could end up in like your 30s, your 40s, and suddenly something is not clicking. You just feel overwhelmed, and your brain tells you, there's something going on, and it's not depression. It looks like anxiety, but it's just not anxiety. It's kind of weird. And then you end up being told you're ADHD. So I understand that a lot of people are kind of like trivializing this because they are saying, oh, everybody's got an ADHD diagnosis or everybody's got an autistic diagnosis. Those are people that have been failed by the system because the system has actually just focused on the very extreme cases that do need to be focused on, and they deserve all the attention. It doesn't mean that those people haven't actually suffered as a result, and they've been bullied and assaulted and abused and everything else. And there's a lot of literature actually documenting all of this. People who are neurodivergent have got an increased risk of all of those things because they are more likely to miss the cues in society that tell them that you need to blend in, and they'll go and, you know, like I did, and had like black nails at 14 and thought that it was fine to, in post-Franco Spain, to have like, you know, red hair one day and black hair the next day, and, you know, and wear like women's clothes one day, and then the next day like men's clothes. And, you know, I would, if you looked at me when I was 15, probably non-binary didn't exist at the time, but I was very much like, you know, I didn't care. I didn't kind of like I didn't think this shop is for men and this shop is for women. I just went in, I just got whatever I wanted and I wore it. I got beaten up a couple of times, like quite badly. There's a lot of these things actually happen to people, and you kind of it's a reminder that you need to fit in.
Yeah.
You know, sexual abuse is massive as well in this kind of like community, and again, it kind of like makes you retreat even more, because you don't want to put yourself in a situation where again you're going to be exposed to that kind of like trauma. So I can understand again that people say everybody's got ADHD these days, and it's been trivialized, and people jokingly say you're very ADHD or you're a bit OCD. You're either OCD because you're OCD, or ADHD, or autistic, or you're not. It's not something that people just come up and say, I just want to be ADHD. There may be a perverse case that somebody is kind of like trying to milk it for whatever reason, but I would say like 99.9%. Why would you put yourself through an assessment which is traumatic in its own right? Because it makes you rewrite your history and question everything that's happened in your life in a different light. You need to come out to people in a way, or keep it to yourself. There's so many things that happen that I wouldn't think anybody would just do it for the attention, to be quite honest. It's very short-lived at the end of the day. You tell somebody, it may be a shock, and then what happens? You know, so if you're doing it for attention, it's the wrong thing to do for attention, because like people will be shocked for 2 days and then they'll forget about it. So
when you went through your diagnosis process and you started looking at your life through the lens of someone with ADHD, where were the penny drops for you? I mean, you mentioned some already with, you know, your habits as a teenager, your coping mechanisms. Did you also see that through the much younger formative years of your life and during your professional career as well in academia?
Yeah, definitely. So if you go my earlier years, there was definitely open to substance abuse, you know, from early age. Alcohol wasn't a big attraction to me, but everything else was. Definitely there was that. I was going out with girls and boys, and, you know, it was all going for me. It didn't matter. I was weirdly quite good in school, so I did really well, but then I was always told off by the teachers that I was like being problematic. I was a joker, and I always hooked up with like the wrong guns as well. So basically, if there was somebody who was problematic, that would be my friend.
That would be your friend.
And my mom was like, "Oh, why are you going out with the twins?" It was like a new neighborhood that was built next to my house. And there were these two twin girls who were completely like dreadful. They were like really badly behaved. They would have got an ASBO, you know, if they were in England, because they were really, really awful. And they were like my best mates. And like I remember at one point they lived in this council tower, and they were chucking eggs at people from like the 12th floor.
Oh wow!
And like, you know, and I'm there and I'm thinking, why am I hanging out with these people? But I think it was like the excitement.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to be like friends with like the boring kids. I wanted to be like on the edge of, you know, something that was a little bit like risky.
Yeah.
And there is definitely that. And I've put myself through situations where, you know, there has been risk in my life many times. When you look at like later life, I think one of the things that happens in neurodivergence in general, and people talk about neurodiversity, neurodivergence. Neurodivergence basically means that the way that your brain works diverges from the norm.
Okay.
And again, I do get a little bit funny about the terms, not so much about the microbiome, but about this.
Sure.
Because there's normal,
Yeah.
and then there's normative, which is basically normal doesn't exist because nothing is normal. There's that normativity, which is basically what society says is normal. But then society is a bit crazy. So, what is normal anyway?
Yeah.
So if you diverge from that normativity, from the norm, then that is neurodivergent. And it's also a kind of like an identity. So there's schools of thought now saying, if your brain works in a different way and you're bipolar, or you're like, you're chronically anxious, that is a form of neurodivergence. Typically is ADHD, autism, OCD, Tourette's. But then the other forms of mental conditions might also self-identify as neurodivergence, just because they don't see the world in the same way as the norm. Then neurodiversity, you cannot be neurodiverse. So neurodiverse is a group. You cannot be a person who has neurodiversity. People throw these terms around a lot these days.
Yeah.
So there is that. But I look at, for example, one of the key things that happens in neurodivergence is emotional regulation and overwhelm, because your world works in a slightly different way to the world that you're living in. And sometimes everything kind of like flows and it's just a little pinch and you can cope with it. But when the pinch becomes too much, whether it's toxicity at work, for example, I experienced that a couple of times. And if you also have an awareness of what your values are and you're very clear on those, and I think the journey for many people who get a late diagnosis is very introspective. It certainly has been for me. So for me, more than a label and me kind of like saying I'm this, I'm that, I'm autistic, I'm ADHD, it's more about how it's made me look at my life and actually think, who am I? Who do I want to be? Am I the best version of myself, without stressing myself out and thinking I always need to be this best version? Sometimes it's a crap version, and that's today, it could be tomorrow, whatever. And then the following 3 days, you're better, and it all balances out. There's a lot of this like fake positivity. It's made me look a lot at how I've processed emotions in the past and how I didn't know how to label my emotions for many years. So I lost my best friend to suicide in 1998. I lost my brother to cancer when I was 8, and he was terminal for 3 years. And I was looking back to those memories of like loss, and I didn't know what I was feeling. Like, I can understand when I was 8, I was very young, but then I can remember things from the 90s, even though they were wild. But I cannot remember what it felt to lose my friend. And I think everybody's brain has got the ability to block negative memories because they are painful. Yeah. And it's a normal kind of like it's your typical coping mechanism. When you are neurodivergent, your emotional regulation, the limbic system, this set of different structures in the brain that deals with your emotions, with how you react to the environment, with threat, it can be hypervigilant, which is how I felt all my life, and it's still a struggle. So something that is tiny for anybody else, it may be a really big deal for me. Now, am I telling you about this in a massive kind of way? Am I letting you know? No, because if I do that, it's gonna make me look weird. It's gonna make me feel like, oh, this guy's just oversharing, about his private life or whatever. So you mask it. So you kind of like pretend that you're okay. Yeah. But it may be a really big deal. It may be that, there's a massive amount of anxiety for coming here today and being here with you. But then randomly, I hadn't looked at the address until this morning, and I'm being driven to the tube station by my other half at the other end of London, and he's saying, I cannot believe you haven't actually looked at the address. I said, well, actually, I have looked at it, but I haven't looked at the route. So I could freak out about something that's going to happen. Like I used to go clubbing a lot in the 90s. I used to know exactly what I was wearing, like a week before, and kind of like fantasize about the whole thing. I knew if I was going to take the night bus back, when I was going to take the night bus back, you know, if I was going to get off my face, when was the last time I could take something, so then I could be like, you know, I could control to go and take the night bus back. I kind of like planned it all like that. If I was going to a festival, I had to book the ticket like, you know, 3 months in advance. I could like, you know, and then I was wild at the festival, but you know, there was all of that kind of thing. So there's like quirks. And emotional regulation for me is massive. It's that kind of ability to not feel overwhelmed by, you know, like in American Beauty, there's that, you know, there's so much beauty, I cannot cope with it. Well, my life is like that in like HD. So I feel everything. Like people think about autistic people, they don't feel, they don't have empathy. I feel everything like, you know, 100 times more than maybe somebody who doesn't have that trait, because it's, you know, that ability to pick up things from the environment. And sometimes when I feel quite calm, I can cope with it, but some other times it can be too much in my brain. So it's that learning how to do all of those things that for many years I just took for granted. I just thought my brain is wacky. I'm just like that. I haven't got a name for it. It's not a condition. And I just put up with myself in a way until a diagnosis actually helped me understand myself a little bit better. And then for me, it's been a journey of discovery and actually just realizing that I have my values that are really important for me. And that I need to live life by those values. I need to be authentic, and I need to be genuine in what I do. I need to be happy with what I do, and have a lot less resilience for crap that happens in my life. So I'm very averse to crap now. So whereas before I could actually put up in a situation that was fairly toxic for a long time, now the moment that I have a whiff of toxicity, I just need to get out of it, because it's just not aligned with who I want to be. So in a way, that's been my journey of self-discovery. And also, there's no treatment for autism. It's just kind of like learning to know yourself better. I've had some psychotherapy, which has been really useful after the diagnosis. Just learning, coming to terms, because initially I had this massive imposter syndrome about being autistic. I'm thinking, how the hell am I autistic? It's like I look at people in the eye, almost like freakishly in the eye like that. You know, like some of the things kind of like did make sense. Like I can be really direct, or I can maybe like miss a cue, but I have a sense of humor. You know, I can empathize, you know, almost too much, and pick up loads of crap from people even when I don't want to. So I didn't see it clearly. I had this kind of like massive stress about not being autistic, and I had been told by the psychiatrist that I was. And she did say, you know, that you're gonna need some psychotherapy to just come to terms, because you are kind of like textbook, but you're not at the same time. And you know, it's kind of like a weird combination. Everybody's diagnosis is different. So you haven't got this typical, you know, very rarely in adulthood have you got this typical, you know, somebody who looks at the eye, retreats, and is inward all the time. That may happen if they pick it up when you're 7, but not when you're like, you know, when you're 50. And with ADHD, I was prescribed medication initially. And I was going through a rough time anyway, because I think all of this that I told you about, going back to trauma from childhood and, you know, losing my brother, like sexual abuse and all sorts of things, it was just resonating in my mind a lot at the time. And I was in a massively toxic environment at work as well that I had to let go of. And I was just completely burnt out. Now, it makes sense looking at it from the autistic ADHD lens now. Looking through that lens, you realize that there's a thing about autistic ADHD burnout, which is basically just not coping with the environment. And it's like regular burnout, but really intense because of the intensity of the emotions that you feel. So taking the medication kind of like helped me get up in the morning. I had chronic pain syndrome as well, so I didn't know what it was. My sister has got a weird autoimmune thing, and I thought it was going to be that. So I was kind of like freaking out. And then I was told it was fibromyalgia, and which was a bit of a label, because it's so difficult. There's no treatment. It's just, it must be stress. I mean, like, hello, you're gonna get the Nobel Prize here. So I was trying to cope with a lot of stuff, and I think the medication helped me kind of like get up. And it's almost like having a triple espresso. It just gives you that, and it's the first thing that you do. It's a bit literally empty stomach. The moment I opened my eyes, I took the meds, and like half an hour later, I was alert, and I kind of like made sense of the world. And
which meds were you on?
I was on methylphenidate, so Ritalin, but like long release. So this thing called Concerta, and it's I've tried some other ones as well. So the amphetamine based as opposed to the methylphenidate, pretty much the same kind of thing. So nice, but kind of made me remove a little bit of the emotional me. So it made me almost like look at myself from the outside and think, I'm doing cool, but it felt a bit weird. It almost felt like I was on drugs. And having had the experience of doing drugs recreationally, it felt very borderline. And then there's this whole thing that you talk to people who, I had a couple of friends, 3 friends diagnosed. They were trying different medications as well. One was really struggling with that as well, saying, I don't want to think about it as in I'm taking something recreational because it makes me feel like a fraud. So I want to think about it as in my brain needs it. I'm thinking, right, okay, well, I want to keep an open mind, but certainly I don't want to see myself at like 70 taking something that's going through my body every day, because I wouldn't do it with anything else that I mean, if you need something really urgent, then you go through that treatment. But something that you're going to take chronically all the time, I'm just thinking, this is taxing my body. My beats per minute were higher. I'm thinking it's putting a pressure on my cardiovascular system. It's all very well that my brain works better with it, but I started feeling a bit weird about like taking them, and I just went cold turkey and I stopped. So I went through a bit of a rough patch, a couple of weeks, a month. I felt a bit weird. And it's
well, it is quite interesting that you were just talking about how diverse people's experiences are of ADHD, yet the treatment is very binary.
Exactly.
And I think with that in mind, you said that there isn't a treatment. I think one of the things that you've learned is setting boundaries, for example, not dealing with toxic environments that you would have otherwise endured prior to that. So I think in a way, your treatment, it comes out perhaps less so in a pharmaceutical manner, but more so in a psychological and a literal environment manner where you can set those.
Absolutely, 100%. I think the change for me has been about knowing myself and almost going back to, like 20 years ago, I wanted to be a yoga teacher. This, like, you were asking me about like, what have you done professionally that was a bit wacky? Well, I've told a couple of people to bugger off in my life, literally, and just like walked off. I remember like the first time I came to London in 94, and I had I was temping and doing bits and bobs and, whatever. And like at one point in 95, I was working for the Japanese Travel Bureau because I did some work practice with the Japanese Travel Bureau in Madrid. And I love Japan. I love everything about Japan, and Japanese culture and whatever. I'm like completely obsessed. So I was like in my element working with Japanese people and picking up some of the language and whatever. And like I had this British woman who was my boss, and she was doing my heading, and I just shouted at her like, I'm not going to say it, but basically I just like shouted very rude to her, and I basically, and the whole office just like stood still. It was like a moment froze in time. All Japanese people just couldn't believe what had just happened. And then he just took me to a room and said, "You're fired." And I said, "Well, I'm pretty sure that, I was pretty clear I was fired." So that was kind of like a big extreme. I've done it a couple of times, but not in that kind of like so extreme kind of like fashion. But then, I had this thing. I was working in medical publishing for many years, and I kind of like thought, I'm gonna become a yoga teacher. This is what I did before doing my nutrition degree. I'm gonna become a yoga teacher. So I did the whole I couldn't just do like ADHD. When you fixate, you want to do like the best. You cannot just do like a week's course. It has to be the all singing and dancing. British Wheel of Yoga, 3 years, every weekend. It's like a degree, basically. So I went through all of that.
Wow.
And I said to my sister is like my number one fan. I love her to bits. She's like my soulmate. And I said, I want to go to Spain, and, my mom and dad have a place in the south of Spain near Malaga. And like, oh, the mountains are so amazing. They're a bit like California. Just get a little plot and just build a yoga center. And like my sister is like, she was doing quite well at the time, and her husband at the time just like bought this little plot of land for me. And like I'm thinking, okay. And then like 6 months later, oh no, I'm not being a yoga teacher anymore.
All right.
Like, that's just, I lost interest. I did a few classes and I thought, no, this is not for me. I'm not gonna be like doing yoga teaching forever.
Yeah.
So I kept a lot of what I learned for me.
Yeah.
But I kind of like went from being completely intensely focused on that to like, what was yoga again?
Yeah.
So
you can see these patterns throughout your life.
Definitely. And a lot of people have got similar patterns, but then they experience life in a different way. So you're right. There are a few types of meds that you can get. There's the ones that are stimulants that are kind of like based on something that, largely looks like speed, like chemically, and will make you feel kind of revved up in the morning and ready to go and focus. And they are the the ones that don't have that effect, basically. I want to say no anxiety. What would I just say?
Anxiolytics or
no the
stimulants
and
non-stimulants.
That's it.
Yeah.
So there's but they are not really prescribed that much. So most people will just go on your Ritalin and your dexamphetamine or kind of like that, those variations like that. There's lisemphetamine now as well that is quite popular because it's kind of like slow release. But from what I know from people who I have talked to, they need to play around a lot with the doses. And if you look at the symptoms, they may have more or less the same symptoms, but then they need to play around with a morning dose, an afternoon dose, a short release. So I was given long release and then short release. Short release felt a bit cheeky because it was almost like, you just did a bit of coke or something. It just felt like really, borderline. And it was quite intense for an hour, and then it just like came down.
Right.
And then I was feeling a little bit towards the end of the day. My other half was saying, you're very, you're shouting at me. I'm saying, I'm not shouting. So I was struggling to regulate. So I was thinking, this is defeating the object.
Yeah.
I think the deal breaker for me was to think that my brain was actually trumping the drugs. So what the drugs were supposed to do, they had done it, and they saw me through the 18 months that I took them. And then my brain was starting to think, all right, okay, so this is what's going to happen now. I'm going to take this and blah, blah. And all of the things that I wasn't supposed to be doing, like, doing nothing until 11 in the morning and watching Netflix when I woke up because I didn't fancy working, and thinking I'm going to watch a couple of episodes of whatever and then start at 11 instead of, I started doing that again.
Okay.
But I was on the meds, and I'm thinking there's no point. The whole point is that I'm going to have a more productive day. I'm going to be happier with that and all the rest of it. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to go to cold turkey. And instead, I've kind of like put together my own method, which is, if we rewind the YouTube or the podcast, a lot of what we talked about, the fiber, the prebiotic of fermented foods. And again, everybody will need to play around with everything because there's no real protocol that anybody can just pick up. Everybody's going to have different degrees of success with it. But I think, in general, taking into account what you're trying to achieve, which is to calm down a hyperactive central nervous system that is in hypervigilant state, to give your prefrontal cortex a little bit more oxygen and nutrients, so it kind of like works better. And that's the bit behind the forehead. So it's logic, decision making, changing from one thing to another, feeling alert, focused, that kind of thing. They are really nice supplements as well that you can incorporate into your routine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna say all about them because I want people to go and like check out my course and put it together.
I was going to say the course is something that should be out by the time this goes, and that's going to walk people through what we were just talking about at the start of this pod, but also a bit more about targeted supplementation and those elements. Are there any broad supplements that you recommend? I mean, I think with my view on supplements, it really has to be targeted. And it has to be real purposeful. And I think I don't want to risk someone just listening to this pod and be like, oh, they said Q10 or oh, they said B vitamin complex or whatever, and they just bundle that into a shopping cart and start taking that every day willy-nilly. So, but are there specific ones that you think?
Yeah, so I'm gonna mention two that I like. So if you look at B vitamins, they're always good for everything. Like anything to do with the brain, B vitamins, you cannot go wrong. B6 particularly, when you're looking, this is like a bit of an indirect thing.
Mm-hmm.
So why are you going to struggle with emotional regulation, get aggy during the day, or your coffee is going to hit in too much and then you feel a bit freaked out or whatever? Probably your sleep hasn't been as restful as you needed.
Mm-hmm.
B6 and sleep is a nice pair. So if you have a nice B6, I like a form of B6 that's called P5P. P5P, yeah, pyridoxal 5-phosphate. I think it's called. So it's as you know, there could be B6 oxide or something in like one of the shops that's really crap. It's like £3, and then But this again, I always have in mind that people don't have huge budgets, and I don't go for things that are silly and you can only get from the States or whatever. It's available on Amazon. Good quality, lab tested, whatever, and it'd be like a tenner for a month. So about 50 milligrams. Again, I don't want to prescribe to anybody, but like that's the kind of like dose for a nice B6 that's going to have that kind of effect. So taken in the evening is going to allow you to wind down. It's one of the building blocks in that serotonin and melatonin production line.
Right.
Because serotonin and melatonin are kind of really similar to each other. They're in the same kind of like pathway or production line. So you're feeding into that process, especially if you've had tryptophan-rich foods during the day as well. So your beans or your
pumpkin seeds,
exactly,
squash, turkey.
Exactly. So you have those, and then you have a better ability to transform that tryptophan into nice, absorbable, beneficial forms of tryptophan that will do what they need to do in the brain.
Gotcha.
Including making melatonin. And so that's a favorite of mine. Not because it's gonna make you super acutely focused on everything, like oh, my ADHD is cured. It's because it's gonna give you a really nice quality sleep or make it better, and then you're gonna have a better day the following day. So building block. And then another one is saffron. So saffron has apart from being amazing as a spice, I love it. We use it a lot in Spain. It's got really interesting antioxidants that have got an affinity with brain cells. So what I was saying to you, that when the brain is working and it's a big kind of like machinery computer inside your skull, there's so much activity that is heating up, and there's kind of like smoke, and your immune cells, the glial cells, they get a bit activated. They actually call activated glial cells or microglia. When they do that, the way that the immune system works, one of the way that it works is by producing peroxide. And peroxide, if anybody knows about peroxide, bleaches your hair. It kind of like strips. It's like bleach. So you're basically producing natural forms of bleach inside an enclosed space in the skull that finds it very difficult to self-regulate during the day because it's really busy making you conscious of things and making sure that everything is ticking along. And it starts kind of like cleaning up when you're asleep. So again, B6, better sleep, better cleaning up of the brain. Saffron and the saffron antioxidants have also been looked at as an alternative for complementary treatment for ADHD. The studies are small and they're kind of on certain cohorts as well, so more like children.
Okay.
But then again, the politics of science are important. ADHD is associated with children, with male children.
Yeah.
So there's going to be more funding for that kind of cohort than for females in their 20s or something. So you need to take it with a pinch of salt.
Yeah.
But also it's super safe.
Yeah.
So you cannot overdose.
Yeah.
You know, it's not super expensive. So a nice kind of saffron complex.
Well, saffron's more expensive than gold, right?
It is,
the
yeah,
spice.
but the supplements. So there are
but
certain supplements that contain the standardized extract, which tends to be about 3.5% of the saffron antioxidants.
Gotcha. Right.
Yeah. And that basically is what has been used in certain studies.
Amazing.
And again, none of the supplements by themselves do like this is the cure.
Of course, yeah.
It's the combination. But for me, for anybody, everybody's welcome to like go and get on the course and pay me.
Yeah.
But the most important thing, do it for the right reason. Do it because you want the change to happen.
Yeah. Not
because you think the curcumin or the whatever is going to, you know, the saffron is going to sort you out.
Yeah.
If you combine you're wanting to change something for the better, and that's coming from within, and you're going to honor the time that it takes to feel better.
Yeah.
You're gonna honor your values and your lifestyle choices and everything else, and then you put that layer on top. That's guaranteed to have a much better rate of success than if you just add those things and then you continue to have toxicity in your life. You continue to ignore the cues that the environment is giving you. So I think that's the kind of ideal situation where you're combining the two.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Miguel, I could talk to you for so much longer about not just this subject but other subjects as well. Like we haven't even touched on you know, the differences between quote unquote normal and neurodivergence, and like how one might go about even thinking about diagnosis or therapy for it. I think we're going to have to do that on another pod if you'd come back.
Yeah, definitely.
But I just want to thank you for your vulnerability, your analogies. They're brilliant. The way you communicate science is phenomenal. You know, the amount of work that you've done is brilliant. People can look it up in the show notes that we'll put down as well, your studies. And for you know, just the shared experience. I really hope this is going to help a lot of people think and rethink their life if they might find that there are some patterns that they haven't addressed before. So I really appreciate time.
No, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
If you like that video, then you will love the full library from the Doctor's Kitchen podcast. We talk about inflammation, immune health benefits, and much, much more about food as medicine, including this video right here that you can click through right now.